Everybody can hear me okay, I assume?
Can
I can
definitely
hear
hear you.
you.
Yep.
So, as Jennifer mentioned, Carly and I are going to be kind of co-presenting here today. I have two presentations this week, so if I start talking about the wrong one, somebody jump in and let me know. Um, so prior to this, I asked Jennifer what folks' knowledge was of the Stormwater Manual, and I kind of got the impression that maybe most of you have heard of it, but are not regular users of it, and some of you maybe haven't heard. So I tried to find a balance between the two, but feel free to jump in if you have questions along the way for clarification. Next slide. So we're going to talk about four things today. I'm just provide a very brief overview of the manual. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Then we'll talk about what recent updates we have, what future plans we have for updating it, and then the role of monitoring and updating the manual, because I know this is a monitoring group, and I actually lived in the monitoring world back in the 90s and through the first part of the 2000s.
Yeah.
Next slide.
I just wanted to check. I'm presenting the right screen, right? Like you guys can see the presentation and not the notes part.
Yes,
Correct.
you can. Or yes, we can.
Okay, great.
So the first part here is an overview of the manual. Next slide. We have a whole page in the manual that describes what the manual is. I don't think there's really anything more than what this sentence describes. It is a product that helps the everyday user better manage primarily urban stormwater. There's a lot of applications that can be extended into agriculture or other areas, but it is primarily designed for the urban community. Next slide. So what's in the manual? I guess, there we go. Yeah, why don't you just show them all instead of having to go through this. So there's a lot of stuff in the manual, and this is just a snapshot. There's a whole lot more that I could have put here, but primarily, and I'll go through the history of the manual briefly in the next slide, I believe. It provides specifications and guidance for how to design, construct, operate, maintain, and assess stormwater best management practices. A stormwater best management practice being something like a rain garden or a tree trench or permeable pavement. It contains information on various pollutants, stormwater volume, how to manage volume, runoff, and how to address these through stormwater management. There are several pages on specific topics, such as a page on solar farms, a page on alleviating compaction, information on pollinators, models, soils, monitoring, etc., etc. There is general stormwater information. What is stormwater? And that's geared towards more general audiences, obviously. There is information on regulations. Pollution Control Agency obviously is the permitting authority for stormwater in the state, and so the manual supports our permits. Lots of case studies in the manual, and it really is a warehouse. It's become a warehouse for all kinds of stuff. Archived documents, links to other sources of information, links to research or communities, research organizations. So it's kind of become a warehouse also. Next slide. The original manual was written in PDF format, and it's shown, the cover is shown at the top. It was updated in 2008 to include some additional information on pollutant removal. For those of you who are aware of the minimal impact design standards, there was a work group that formed in 2009 or somewhere in there and worked for about 3 years to develop these standards. And what they really, these standards were designed to kind of continue to push us in the stormwater world towards low impact development, green infrastructure, more nature-based solutions, and away from the traditional way that stormwater had been managed. In 2011, we received money to update the manual, and the first thing we did was look at the format, and with that, we then converted it into a wiki format on the advice of our IT folks. So if you hear me refer to the wiki from now on, and that's actually the way I prefer to refer to it, as a manual wiki or the wiki, that's what I'm referring to, is the fact that it's now in this electronic format. And since 2013, we've continued to receive money in decreasing amounts to update and expand the material in the manual. So the manual now has about 1,400 pages in individual pages. It's got something on the order of 2,000 photos, tables, links. It's really become quite a monster, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too, what we're going to do about that, hopefully, in the coming year. Next slide. So Carly, if you want to click on this link. So for those of you who have not been to the manual, if you were to go to the table of contents page, this is what you would see. You'll see there's a left toolbar similar to Wikipedia, so it's written in MediaWiki, same format that Wikipedia is written in. Some of the links on the left are the same, some are different than Wikipedia, but it's a way to get around. There's a couple of different ways to get around in the manual. On the left toolbar, you'll see this index or categories. That's a good way to get around, and we're going to increasingly try to promote the use of that for getting around the manual. There's also the search box at the top. We have found that we're estimating about 80 to 90% of the people that get into the manual wiki get there from an external web search like Google. And so you'll see that you would see that a lot of our titles actually are just keywords, nothing more than keywords designed to help these external folks get to it. So on this table of contents, we've divided it into a couple major categories: introduction to the manual, stormwater concepts, and stormwater management. And so every one of these blue texts is a link to another page, and it would take you sometimes to a page that has content on it. Sometimes it would take you to another table of contents that has additional information, because some of these subjects, like if you were to scroll down to stormwater infiltration, for example, you would, and you were to click on that, you would find that there's several pages that link to that page. The real meat and potatoes of the wiki is this stormwater control practices section that's right about in the middle of the page now. This is where you find information on the best management practices. And we've divided them into a couple different formats by type. Is it a construction practice? Is it a post-construction practice? Or by treatment mechanism. Does it a pre-treatment or a filter? Does it infiltrate water? And so forth. One of the neat tools that we've underutilized in the wiki is this image on the right, where if you hover over something, you can actually link to another page in the manual, as well as a description of what you're seeing there. That's a tool that's used quite a bit in Wikipedia. You'll see a section on regulatory and permitting, and a section on models, calculations, methodologies, pollutant removal, and credits. Credits really being nothing more than how much pollutant removal or volume removal can you get with a particular stormwater practice. There's a whole section on case studies, some virtual tours, and some information on communications and outreach, including a page on trainings and webinar that we do here with the PCA. Stormwater research and education links, and then finally some references and reference information at the bottom of this page. So that's a real quick overview of what's in the wiki. I really didn't intend on going to anything specific unless somebody has a desire to do that. We can do that either now, or we can come back to that later and move around in the wiki. But it's kind of designed to be like Wikipedia, where you move from page to page. On any given page, you'll find lots of links to other places in the manual or outside of the manual. So let's go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint. And then the next slide. So we're always updating the manual because we have in-house resources to do that, as well as some money to work with through our master contract to contract out some items. I'm going to talk about 5 recent updates. Carly's actually going to talk about the 5th one, green infrastructure. That's a really important topic, and she'll spend a little bit of time on that. So you can always find what's new in the manual too by going on the left, that left toolbar I talked about, and there's a what's new section, and that takes you to, we don't update it all that frequently, but whenever we have enough material to justify going in and updating it, we do that. You can see the most recent update was done on March 28th, and we're probably due for another one pretty soon here. Next slide. So manufactured treatment devices is something we've been working on for about 2 years now. These are largely underground proprietary filtration practices. They're generally used in areas where you can't put an above ground practice because of space constraints, or and that's primarily the places. So downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul, highly impervious areas where it would be very expensive to put in above ground practices or other practices. These are the places where you'll see these practices put in. And what we've done is we've developed credits for total suspended solids and phosphorus removal for these practices. We're developing protocol developed on Washington State's approaches. And then we have to figure out how to translate these fluid removal numbers into annual removal numbers. We're seeing these devices used more and more, and so there is a desire to get this information out there sooner than later. Next slide. We're updating the vegetation portion, and I believe that was our initial connection with Jennifer. Karen Jensen, some of you know Karen, was originally in the group, and unfortunately Karen's been dealing with some health issues, and then Jennifer was kind enough to join our green infrastructure group. I'm not sure if she's actually on the vegetation group, but their vegetation and green infrastructure are obviously very, very similar topics. So we're going to be working on vegetation, have been working on it, and we'll continue to work on it in the coming years. This is a pretty significant undertaking. There's lots of stuff in the manual on vegetation, but it's kind of buried. It really has not become a topic unto itself here until the past year. And so now we have a page in there called Operation and Maintenance Considerations for Vegetation and Stormwater Management. So vegetation is going to become increasingly important in stormwater management in the future as we move towards green infrastructure. And you can see a couple green infrastructure practices here. A solar farm on the lower right, planted to native perennial vegetation, and then of course a vegetated swale on the left. Plant selection tool, the one Blue Thumb currently has a plant finder. It's primarily for homeowners. It's going to be now extended to have a lot of stormwater search capability. So what best management practice, for example, should I put if I have this kind of best management practice, what vegetation should I select? If I'm in a area where there's a lot of road salt being applied, what practices or what vegetation should I consider? So the plant selection tool is going to be undergoing a facelift here in the next year. And Metro Blooms is working with Dan Shaw from Bowser on that, but we're obviously maintaining good contact with them. We're going to continue to work on design, construction, and more general information, including some specialty topics such as what vegetation should you be putting at solar farms. Next slide. Iron enhanced sand filters. So for years, decades actually, we've gone after phosphorus in stormwater, but we've largely been going after phosphorus attached to sediment. Things like stormwater ponds, traditional bioretention systems have done a pretty good job removing total phosphorus They don't remove dissolved phosphorus. If at all, they don't remove it very well. If we can't start to remove dissolved phosphorus, we're not going to clean up our lakes and rivers. Dissolved phosphorus is typically about anywhere from 20 to 50% of total phosphorus, and if these BMPs are not removing dissolved phosphorus, we're not going to get there. Plus, dissolved phosphorus is a lot more bioavailable than phosphorus that's attached to sediment. So it's been overlooked way too long. So now we're starting to see practices like iron enhanced sand treatment. So it's a typical sand filter, but what's happened is they've added a layer of iron below the main filtration practice. And so the dissolved iron does not get attenuated or retained in that upper sand layer, but as it passes through this iron enhanced layer, the iron scavenges the dissolved phosphorus out. And so we now have about 150 of these sites that we know of, probably more. Unfortunately, the guidance on how to design, maintain, and construct these has lagged behind. And so we will be beefing that up, working with researchers at the University of Minnesota, Andy Erickson, John Gulliver, to improve our knowledge and guidance on this particular practice. Next slide. The major source of dissolved phosphorus is organic material. And so we've been finding, or I should say researchers like Bill Selbig in Wisconsin have been finding that, well, if you sweep your streets in July, it's not gonna do much for you. But if you sweep them during leaf drop, it could really go a long ways towards removing a lot of organic debris, which is the primary source of this dissolved phosphorus that I've been talking about. So we have worked with the researchers again, Sarah Hobby and others at the University of Minnesota. We've been in communication with folks in Wisconsin and New Hampshire and the Chesapeake Bay, trying to come up with guidance and tools to better manage street sweeping. And not just do it because we do it in the fall and the spring twice a year, but do it to actually target these times of the year when we think that you can really make an impact on removing this organic material that is the source of phosphorus. So we have the street sweeping calculator. If you're a city, you can now go out, and if you can measure, and there are some easy guidance, hopefully relatively easy to guidance to follow, you can measure the weight or volume of material you're collecting. You can plug that into this calculator and it'll spit back pounds of phosphorus that you are reducing. And behind all of this, we've got several pages on guidance, best practices for managing for street sweeping. And the University of Minnesota Extension folks, we're working with them to develop, they're the ones developing it, but we're helping them to develop training and outreach sessions targeted primarily towards street sweepers themselves about best practices. And the next slide, and I think this is where I pass it on to you, Carly.
Yes, it is. So the green infrastructure work in the manual really kicked off in 2020. So we've been working on developing content, I guess, for like the last 2 years now. And we really wanted to look at restructuring the green infrastructure manual based on stakeholder feedback. So thank you to anybody that's on the call that was involved in any of this work. It's been super helpful, and we've been able to create pages and sections and content with your help. I think I'm going to just go right into opening up the manual. But based on stakeholder feedback, we did identify key recommendations that they felt would be really important to include in the manual. And those kind of, I guess, 4 areas would be the operation and maintenance, case studies, planning for green infrastructure, and then the training piece. So I'm presenting the green stormwater infrastructure or GSI page on the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. It kind of gives you an overview of what green infrastructure is. And then if we scroll down, it kind of divides up into different sections. So we have green stormwater infrastructure and sustainable stormwater management, green stormwater infrastructure best management practices, And under this header, you can find the operations and maintenance of green stormwater infrastructure. So I'm going to open that. And once you're on this page, it dives into 8 individual green infrastructure practices, and each one of them kind of goes into depth of what O&M looks like for different phases in the process. So just a general overview, and then we get into the design phase O&M, the construction phase, the post-construction phase, and then some typical maintenance costs to consider moving forward. There's also a supplemental information page associated with each practice. And the supplemental information is a little bit more specific to that practice. So if maybe you have questions about erosion or seeding or snow storage, what that should look like for that individual practice, that's there as well. And then we are actually in the process right now of finalizing our planning page for green infrastructure. So you can see it's currently undergoing final review, but this is the idea of what it will look like. And basically, the whole idea behind this page is how to plan for green infrastructure in your community. It also goes into, roadblocks that people may face during the planning phase, any permitting things to consider, public outreach, things like that. So hopefully that will be reviewed shortly, and then it'll be in its final stage. In addition, we do have a number of case studies that I've worked with local organizations in here. So I'll click on one, but it's kind of fun to see the different projects that have taken place and the different green infrastructure practices that they have implemented. And, for this one too, they implemented a green roof, but they also implemented solar panels too at the Dakota Ice Center. So that was an interesting one. And then the last part, so with green infrastructure, not only are there benefits to stormwater management, but we kind of also want to highlight the multiple benefits that come with green infrastructure practices. So right now we're also in the stage of kind of developing what those will look like. I think this one, the constructed wetlands, I think is the most complete one, but this is a general setup of what the other practices will look like to kind of highlight the other benefits that are associated with installing these practices besides just stormwater management. Sorry, my mouse keeps getting all wonky on me. Oh, and the last piece I did not touch on, but another element that was kind of important was the training and certification piece for green infrastructure that the stakeholders were interested in, and we're kind of working on, like what that would look like in the future. The last thing, so continuing, to add information into the manual and working on adding the multiple benefits, as I mentioned. And then we also want to tie in that climate resiliency piece and kind of like what that looks like. And we're still building and like kind of brainstorming what that could look like for green infrastructure going forward. So I think, Mike, it's back to you.
Thanks, Carly. So what future work is planned? I'm going to touch on 2 things. Number one is specific work that we're going to be doing or are doing in the now or in the near future. And then I'm going to talk some big picture stuff in the next slide. So obviously we're going to continue to work on green infrastructure and volume control. It's funny how there are multiple camps with this green infrastructure. Can it do anything for volume, particularly extreme rain events? And so I've heard both sides of that story, both extremes, where folks will say, well, green infrastructure will take care of that. Well, no, it won't. But I've also heard green infrastructure can't help with extreme events. And in fact, that's no longer the case either. What we're finding interesting is that, of course, there's always new designs coming out. And we're starting to see some new designs that take green infrastructure and tweak it in a way, and in some cases combine it with gray infrastructure, or put in new design adjustments to the green infrastructure practices that then allow them to handle more volume, because we do anticipate more volume in the future as our climate continues to change. We will continue to work on vegetation. I talked about that. We have a long list of, and if you remember the pages that Carly showed, there were a lot of red text areas. Those are pages that do not exist yet, but will exist hopefully at some point in the not too distant future. So they're planned. Underground filters, we need to work on these because some of our guidance in the manual didn't specify whether a practice should be, the guidance should be for above or below ground. Unfortunately, what we're seeing are some underground practices that are following the guidance, but not to the point where these practices can be easily maintained because they're now underground. We're finding that some of these practices are very difficult to access and maintain. So this is an area that we need to work on. Several BMPs need updating. Permeable pavement, harvest, reuse, ponds, sand filters are all in need of updating. The stormwater world continues to change very quickly, and this is one of the really nice features of the wiki platform. If you go to stormwater manuals in other states, you'll find that a lot of them are dated 2008, 2010, and at the time they were very good, and they may still have 80–90% of the information may still be very relevant. But unfortunately, stormwater, or fortunately or whatever, stormwater world continues to evolve fairly rapidly, and the wiki allows us to make these changes on the fly, provided we have the resources to do so. And I mentioned about the wiki itself has become a bit of a monster. We are in the process of looking at it, potentially reorganizing it, and tediously going through every single page in the wiki and updating every page, updating links, getting them up to speed, and so hopefully next winter, by next winter, the wiki will be a little bit easier to get around in. It's become a little bit disorganized. Next slide. So some of these big picture items, and these aren't necessarily specific topics, but these are kind of maybe themes that we're going to be hopefully working around and pointing towards in the future. The manual, when it first came out, was largely targeted mostly towards engineering practices. How do we build something? And now we're finding that I think that we need to maybe expand that knowledge and start working with other folks, foresters, landscape architects, other disciplines, to expand stormwater, and Carly touched on this, expand beyond just the stormwater world and start looking at building stormwater practices that have multiple benefits. Can it sequester carbon? Can it act as habitat, and so forth? And this gets into the whole theme of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, climate resiliency, for example. And then we also need to look at watershed-based management. We have found, for example, and I noticed that Joe Mulcahy, I don't know if he's still online, but he's part of a work group that I'm in, and we've recently read a report that said an individual pond by itself has performed pretty well over the years. But if you look at all the ponds together on a watershed scale, they maybe haven't done what we expected them to do. And so maybe we need to step back a little bit and start thinking about, well, okay, if we're going to build ponds, it's a great BMP, but maybe it needs to be coupled with some other practices up in the watershed or down in the watershed or whatever. So more of this watershed-based approach. And there's constantly new technologies coming out, and we have to kind of stay in touch with those. And again, that's a real advantage of the wiki, is if I get a call from somebody saying, have you considered this particular new design, I can talk to them about it and we can consider whether or not that's something we need to think about incorporating into the manual. Next slide. So I know this is a monitoring work group, at least that's the focus of the group, and so I wanted to make sure that I presented some information on that. We don't put information into the wiki in a vacuum. I remember my advisor back in grad school when I handed him my first paper that we were going to submit to a referee journal, and he ripped out about half of the pages and turned to me in a very nice way, said, we don't write junk for journals. Journals don't take junk, and we like to think of that in the manual. We don't put junk in the manual. So we really rely on monitoring and research before we start putting stuff into the manual. So I'm going to talk about 3 types of monitoring that help feed us information. Monitoring and receiving waters, that'd be lakes, streams, wetlands when applicable. Monitoring of stormwater outfalls, and then monitoring of individual stormwater BMPs. Next slide. So even though we don't have direct links to most of you who monitor receiving waters, we rely very much on that information. It provides us with information on trends. It helps us identify emerging issues, chloride being a classic example. If you see this image of Jarvis Lake chloride concentrations, you can see the trend is going up. It tells us we've got a problem here. And where's the chloride coming from? It's obviously, most of it's coming from road salt and stormwater runoff. It helps identify the effectiveness of stormwater practices. And the image on the right, this is from the Met Council, shows us that we are seeing improvements in most of our waters in the Twin Cities metro area. Well, what's causing that? And then we need to answer that question. Is it partly or hopefully significantly due to improved stormwater management? We need to get those answers. And it assists permittees with stormwater permit compliance. This headline on the bottom, 53 water bodies will be removed from the state impaired waters list. And a lot of those are because of improved stormwater management. Next slide. Monitoring stormwater outfalls is obviously important. Now these are the big outfalls. So I believe like in Capital Region Watershed District, they have something like 10 or 11 of these outfalls that dump directly into receiving waters. So this is all stormwater. It helps us understand what's in stormwater. And we know, for example, from this information, and this is from Capital Region Watershed District, we know that the dissolved phosphorus concentration is much higher in snowmelt than it is in rainfall. And this helps us to attack this particular problem that I talked about earlier. So what are we going to do about that? Does that mean we have to remove more organic material in the fall? Is that where that dissolved phosphorus is coming from in snowmelt? And so it also helps us with our communication with the research community. They're the ones that we can turn to and say, hey, it looks like we've got this pulse of dissolved phosphorus coming in the spring. Help us understand what's causing that. There's also this information on land use to the right here. We know that dissolved phosphorus is more prevalent in residential areas, and that makes sense because that's where you've got more leaves. These outfalls, we can look at them for trends. It can help us identify these emerging issues, and it can help assist with compliance also. Next slide. And of course, the individual best management practices themselves. How are they performing? We assign these numbers to them, expecting a certain removal, and when they get more or less removal, we want to know why. Because these are, we can't measure every outfall in stormwater. It's not like a wastewater treatment plant where you can go out and you can take a sample. There's dozens and dozens of these stormwater outfalls. It's impossible to monitor them. So we really rely on these best management practices performing at a certain level. And so we have to monitor these practices to know what that level is. Next slide. So why is concentration and load information important? Well, historically, if you write a total maximum daily load, it just says that city X has to reduce its loading by X amount. Well, that doesn't really, it helps in the sense that we know what our target is, but we know that not all land uses are equal, for example. We need to know, well, what are the priority areas and what practices are best for that, are going to be most effective in those priority areas. We can then feed that information into models and help assess progress. Two images on the right here. For example, let's say a TMDL says we have to reduce phosphorus by 30%. Well, we have a residential area here, and we know that a lot of that phosphorus is going to be in the dissolved form. So maybe we want to ratchet up on street sweeping. We want to focus on fall and early spring. What practices can we do to go after that? Compared to this commercial industrial area, mixed land use area on the lower image, where we have about half the total phosphorus in the runoff, and a lot of that's going to be attached to sediment. So that's going to drive the best management practices we're going to recommend for that particular land use. Next slide. And this is just a table showing what those pollutant removal numbers are. When we get monitoring data that says, well, we've done this recently, for example, with constructed stormwater wet ponds. We've lowered the expected removal of that, and we think it actually maybe that number, that 84% particulate phosphorus number, we think that might actually be too high now too, based on some recent findings. So we really rely on monitoring information to tweak these numbers for how effective these practices are. Next slide. This is just an example from the East Coast. We don't use impervious cover here in Minnesota. Maybe we should, but it shows that. So we go out and so this is a close link between monitoring impervious cover and working with the IBI folks that do the monitoring. And what we found is that when we start to get over about 10% impervious cover in a watershed, that the biology in streams really starts to show negative impacts. And if you get up over 25%, it becomes non-supporting. Next slide. And again, I mentioned research. We have close linkages with research community. Of course, the University of Minnesota here, the very active research group, but other folks too, the folks out in Washington State, Bill Hunt's group at North Carolina State, others across the country. There's a lot of research being done in stormwater now, and it's important to keep in contact with those folks. Next slide. And of course, monitoring of climate, keeping an eye on this. And we can see that precipitation trends are trending upward here in the Twin Cities metro area. Next slide. I believe that is it. So we'll open it up at this point for questions, comments, whatever. And thank you, by the way, for inviting us to talk here. We're always glad to get out and share information.
Absolutely. Thank you both for your presentation. It was fantastic. At this point, we're going to open up for questions. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and hopefully we can help get those questions answered. I mean, I have a personal question, and we'll see. When are we planning on reconvening to start work on all this new work that we have ahead of us?
Well, what we do is as you're aware, I believe you're on the green infrastructure group. I'm not sure if you're on the vegetation group too, but whenever we have a topic that comes up, we form work groups around that. Technical groups consisting of generally 5 to 10 people, and it usually involves us twisting people's arms to get them on the group, but sometimes they join very, very willingly. And I believe in your case, you were more than happy to join, which is great. So to answer your question, the green infrastructure thing, I think we're ready to maybe get that planning document out to that group. The vegetation group, we're getting close to having that document ready to go to that group. So these groups generally work kind of on their own schedule. And then when the tech group signs off on these, we generally will post this information in our newsletters, on the manual, and sometimes we'll send out mass email lists and things. And generally when we've got enough information on a particular topic, we'll have a webinar on that topic too. So those are our main communication avenues at this point, and we're always open to suggestions for getting information out. I'm not an outreach person myself, but I think that generally technical people like me have done a relatively poor job over the years of getting stuff out to folks. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
Yeah, that definitely does. I want to point your attention to Sarah's question in the chat. And so she was asking, how do you get the majority of your monitoring data?
well, it depends on the kind of monitoring you're talking about. With the research, it's mostly by working with people. I'm a highly introverted person by nature, but just out of necessity, I've had to make contact with literally hundreds of people, and so it is through communication with folks. And Andy Erickson, John Gulliver at the University of Minnesota, for example, I'm in constant communication with them, but also other researchers, and I rely on those people to point me to the other people too. So it's this chain effect. And I did work in the monitoring world for a while, the surface water, groundwater. I worked in groundwater, so I have connections there too. People like Sherry Croning here, and of course your monitoring folks at the Met Council and that. So I don't know if I'm doing a good job or not answering your question, but it's just talking to people and hoping that they give me a call when something new pops up.
So say, Sarah, I wanted to invite you to also engage with your question here if you want to come on camera.
Hi, Mike. Thanks. Yeah, I think that answered it. It was really, is this something you're actively reaching out for, or is it more ad hoc, like just really asking around for that? I know that data is super valuable, and kind of a follow-up with the amount of BMP monitoring that we do and the need for a lot of that on the ground BMP monitoring. We talk a lot as a monitoring team how best to monitor a lot of these, especially new ones where there isn't always cut and dry guidance for this is exactly how you monitor manufactured treatment devices and the timing and different pieces like that, grabs versus composite samples, and that can really dictate obviously the results of that. And then that has big implications for like you talked about having load calculations and credits and things like that. So that's something we discuss in our MRM program a lot, is how best to monitor these. So I guess my follow-up question is, do you, I've been on the wiki a lot, not recently, so I don't know if there has been updated guidance on any of this, but do you include guidance on monitoring for specific types of BMPs? So as new technologies come out, would there be guidance on here's how you would hopefully best monitor this, and if you do, here's we want the data, or something like that?
We try to do that. In fact, we do have some monitoring. Jennifer, I can send you the links to this if you're interested. We now have monitoring information related to TMDL compliance, and so we have 4 pages. One is how to monitor lakes and rivers. Another would be specific BMPs. Others would be outfalls and things like that. So yes, and MTDs, the manufactured treatment devices, we do have guidance on that we borrowed from Washington's TAPE program and modified it for Minnesota. It's one of the problems that I've noticed with the wiki is it's become so large that unfortunately a lot of people don't know what's in it, including sometimes myself even. Getting the word out to folks about what's in there is really challenging, and that's one of the things we're looking at in this reorg. So yeah, there is monitoring information in there. I wouldn't say it's always state of the art, and it's not on everything, but Jennifer, I can try to maybe send you a few links to that. Maybe if you went into the wiki and tried searching on monitoring, you might find what's in there.
Yeah, I think that this might actually be an opportunity if you all are open to of just sharing those links with the community, and then maybe there could be some, if anyone is interested within TC-WaMoDaG, of starting like maybe a small stormwater subgroup of just talking about things, and maybe we could continue to bounce ideas back and forth between this monitoring group and the stormwater manual folks, and then maybe we can create a synergy where it's possible.
And one thing we don't have in the wiki is we do not have, I mentioned those pages that have tables of contents on them, and what we don't have in the wiki is a portal or a table of contents for monitoring.
Yeah.
It might be high time to go ahead and create that. And sometimes that's nothing more than a bunch of links to other sites, but sometimes that's fine.
Yeah, and I know we at the steering team have been talking about also trying to develop some monitoring guidelines, or at least advice for folks within the metro. So this actually might be a two birds, one stone situation.
Okay.
So, were there any other questions? And I also have one more question. Emily, go for it first. I've already asked a question.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in the technology side of this. When you first launched the wiki, did you need to have a really intense IT presence who set a lot of it up, or is it something that more of a scientist with a little bit of a technical IT bent can use mostly on their own?
We had to have IT do the what's called the skin. I'm not a web person, but I learned that term. So they're the ones that built the toolbar on the left side and the search box and things like that. So they built the basic functionality because they knew MediaWiki and I did not. I can work in the wiki, so I'm the content person. So I didn't know HTML. I know more about it now for sure than I did then. So we do need IT support to keep the platform running. But 99% of the work at this point is us working in it and doing the coding and that kind of thing. It's
Great,
not,
thank you.
and I always tell people, if I can do it, anybody can do it.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful to know.
And then I will also just assume this answer, but if anyone within this group is interested in working with you, would you be willing to connect and have them email you? Is that a good way for them to contact?
Absolutely, yeah. And if there is interest in creating this monitoring portal in the wiki, I probably will reach out back to you and see if there is interest in doing that.
Okay.
And like I said, it might be nothing more than a lot of links. For example, we have a pollinator page in the wiki, and there's no new material there. It's nothing but a bunch of links to other people who already invented the wheel. There's no reason for us to do it.
Fantastic.
But
Sarah,
the wiki does get used, by the way. I should point that out. We had a crash in 2020, and so we can't count hits anymore. But prior to that, over roughly a 6 or 7 year period, we had 26 million hits on the wiki. So it does get used.
Yeah, those
So
are some good numbers.
just having a portal on monitoring in there may have value just for that reason, that there are people that go into it.
Fantastic. Sarah, I'm going to be contacting you about this, so heads up. Again, I want to thank everybody for coming. Special thanks for Mike and Carly. So if we were in person, we would clap. So if you can, virtually send some applause, that would be appreciated. We appreciate your time. Again, I will one more time drop. Oh, there you go. There's some kudos from Sarah on this. I will one more time just drop the link to remind you all about the TC-WaMoDaG website. It is a resource for the whole community. So sometimes we forget about it, but I'm going to keep on bringing it up so people don't forget about it. And then lastly, be on the lookout. I think there will be some surveys to see if anyone is interested in this work so we can start pulling together a small team, because I think this is a really exciting direction for us to go into. So again, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful Wednesday afternoon.
Thank you again.